Apologies for the technical issues here. Thanks for bearing with us. We have just been privileged to view a quietly devastating and heartbreaking film about one community on the edge of the abyss. A film that is the culmination of a decade-long labor of love by Glenn Kurtz, who has joined us this evening from San Francisco to talk about this haunting film, 3 Minutes, A Lengthening. Good evening, and thank you for joining us at the Teaneck International Film Festival. My name is Barry Lichtenberg. The format for this evening is that Glenn and I will have a conversation, and we will leave time for your questions, so please put them in the chat function. By way of introduction, I am the son of a Holocaust survivor from Warsaw, Poland, not far from Nasielsk. So this film resonates with me in a deeply personal way, but I think it touches us all. The film's horrific juxtaposition of carefree kids mugging in front of a tourist's movie camera with the utter hell that awaits them barely 1 year later is hard to bear. You just want to scream or run for your lives. Glenn, can you tell us what initially drove you to undertake this project? Why did you do it?
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for being here, Barry. Well, a couple of things I think led me to pursue it. The first, just as you mentioned, that there's this almost unbearable sense of immediacy that we have when we see these images, which in and of themselves are perfectly, benign and indeed charming. And yet we know something that the people in them don't know. And the moment I saw this, I had this tremendous sense of responsibility to those people. And I guess another aspect of this is I found it, when my father was dying, and he died shortly after I found the film. And so I had literally inherited this footage. And I felt that these people were now my responsibility. Their memory was my responsibility. And if I didn't do something to try to honor them, then they would again be erased in the way that, the Holocaust wasn't intended to. So I just felt that the images were so haunting and so precise, and they showed individual people, and I wanted to be able to say who they were.
And that's the key, I think, to the film, their individuality. I mean, you must have viewed this film hundreds of times by now, especially your grandfather's clip. So, what does viewing the film do to you today, as opposed to, say, when you first saw it?
Honestly, I have a very similar reaction today that I did when I first saw it, which is just that, I worked very hard, and I had amazing things happen in the course of the research, and ultimately meeting 7 survivors, 2 of whom actually appear in the film. But that's 7 people, and perhaps we identified 20 or 25 people in the film, but there are hundreds of people in the film. I still have this sense of a tremendous unknown that somehow it's my responsibility to honor and to preserve. So, now 10 years after I found it, and I'm sure that I've seen my grandfather's footage tens of thousands of times, and I've gone through it, frame by frame, thousands of times.
Wow. And you're still
I still have this sense of, excuse me?
Are you still looking to identify more of the faces on the film?
Of course. I am always looking to identify more people. And as a matter of fact, we identified another person just about a month ago. Well, there's a lot of dimensions to this, but Mr. Chandler, whom you hear in the documentary, is still living. As a matter of fact, his birthday is on Wednesday. He'll be 98 years old. And a member, so in the course of the research, of course, I came into contact with a lot of people. The survivors, obviously, and their families, and families of survivors who are no longer living, but who have recollections passed down from their relatives. And then, of course, descendants like me, people who left before the war, whose families left before the war. So there was a large community of people who was kind of built as a kind of byproduct of the research. And this group is still kind of organized. We've become the Nasielsk Society, and we're engaging with the local community. In any case, one member of that community is kind of taken on a very intensive research project. And he came up with a photograph recently that no one had ever seen, and it shows the school, the cheder, where Mr. Chandler and Mr. Glodek and a number of the other survivors and were students. And it had a key to some of the teachers, and it, you know, named a number of people, so it became possible suddenly to give a name to someone else who previously not had a name. So I mean, yeah, it's still possible that we'll be able to identify.
So let's talk about Maurice Chandler for a moment, the little boy with the full cheeks who somehow survived the German invasion and aftermath. How did he do it?
How did he survive? Well, you know, there's no survival story that's simple, and the full details are in my book, and I'll have to refer the audience to that to understand it. But the short version is
it's a great book, by the way. It's an amazing, you know.
The short version is he was in the Warsaw Ghetto. He managed to escape from the Warsaw Ghetto with his brother and 3 other boys from Nasielsk, and they ended up working on farms outside of in the countryside as Jews. But then at some point in the spring of 1942, in the lead up to Operation Reinhard, the law came down that no Jews could live in the countryside anymore. They had to be in ghettos. And the night before he was going to report to the local ghetto, the woman on whose farm he was working asked him what his plans were. And he said, well, I've kind of run out of options and I'll have to go to one of the ghettos. And she said, no, you're not going to go to a ghetto. And that night, her nephew, who worked at the County Hall of Records, showed up at midnight bearing a stolen birth certificate.
Wow.
And they said to him, try to be this person. And they sort of coached him in prayers and, you know, things he would have to know in order to be that person, and then sent him on his way. Of course, he had to leave the town where he was because he was already known there. And he wandered farther out into the countryside, and yeah, he ultimately survived. And I'll simply say that, you know, just having a false papers was hardly a guarantee to success, and certainly not for a Jewish boy for whom there was one test you could not pass. So just having papers was the start, but the actual survival story is much more complex and involves enormous amounts of
So luck. How did he react? How did he react when you showed him the film for the first time?
Yeah, you know, I spoke to him literally moments after he first saw the film online. And the first thing that he said to me was, "You've given me back my childhood." And I mean, it still gives me chills to say that today. He, you know, was the sole survivor from his family and had lost, obviously, not only his immediate family and his extended family, but the entire town, the entire community, the entire culture in which his life had taken place. And because of that trauma, I think everything that happened before had this kind of mystical quality to him. And then all of a sudden he sees himself surrounded by his friends and people that he knew. It was it opened up a part of his life to him that he himself, I think, had felt was just kind of locked away and closed off because there was no one he could share it with.
Well, 100 out of 3,000 Jews survived Nasielsk. And I understand that you yourself have visited Nasielsk a number of times. Can you describe the town today, what it's like? Anything remains other than the linden trees in the book?
Yeah, you know, I've been back to Nasielsk, I think 8 or 10 times now. I first went back in 2012, just as a sort of tentative research foray to see if there was anything left. And that question of what remains, it's a complicated question, I guess, because it depends on what you count as a remainder. You know, there are no Jews left in the town. There are homes that were formerly owned or lived in by Jews. It depends on how you search. The cemetery was completely destroyed during the war. All of the headstones were removed by the Germans, but that plot of land is still there and was preserved as an integral, unit by the local community. The synagogue was torn down, but the pieces of the synagogue were distributed to help repair wartime damage. And so there are pieces of the synagogue in homes throughout the town. There are gouges in the door frames where mezuzahs, as it says in the film, were once mounted. So, what remains? Traces. You have to really learn how to search for them. And there's always more than you think there will be.
But has there been some sort of reckoning or acknowledgement of the Jews in Nasielsk who were killed? The archives that the film and the book quote from Ringelblum saying how, the Polish neighbors laughed at the Jews during this horrific roundup, and only a few isolated instances in which they actually, the Poles gave the Jews money or food to survive. Like, is this story, the school children know about what happened, or what's the absence of what's
well
there?
When I showed up there in 2012, the answer to that question was clearly no. And in fact, if you went onto the history page of the town's website, you would not encounter the fact that Jews made up half of the town's population for 400 years. There was no mention of that. However, in the course of these years of going back, and I mentioned the cemetery at some point in 2014, I went back with a large group of this kind of community that had been built, and we revisited the town and formed this plan to reclaim the cemetery. And so we went back every year after that and started kind of cleaning up the cemetery, and then we placed a historical marker there. And now there's a memorial, which we just dedicated this past May. And in the course of those years, just going back for a week or so a year, we made contacts with people in the community. We made friends. People started coming to us and saying, oh, my grandmother told me this story, or my parents, kept this object. And so in the course of those years, there's been a tremendous transformation. And just last year, a year ago this September, one of the local teachers had applied for a grant, which she won, and she created a curriculum for the entire school system from kindergarten through high school, for the students to study Jewish culture and history. So they learned about the food, they learned about songs and dances, they learned about the religion and about the mythology and the folklore. And they approached it from the perspective of the living culture rather than from the perspective of the Holocaust. And that actually created an opening for the students. And now, I'll just tell you one last story. So we were there in May to dedicate this memorial. And there was a member of our group who couldn't be there with us on that day. And he just showed up a few days later. And he was walking across the marketplace, and he was looking for where the synagogue used to be. And he stopped a local kid and said, hey, do you know where the synagogue used to be? And they said, yeah, over there. It's a simple story, but it blows my mind that, he just asks a random person on the street and they know. And that, to me, in some sense, is the sort of measure of the transformation. And it wasn't a big deal. And he wasn't, followed by, townspeople everywhere he went after that. It was just a perfectly, he'd asked where the post office was. They know now. And that's been a transformation over the course of 10 years. And it's because I think we kept showing up, but it's also that the people in town were willing to meet us and to listen and to learn and to investigate their own family histories.
So there's hope.
Yeah, I think there is.
What stands where the synagogue used to stand? What is there today?
There's an apartment block, a Soviet era apartment block or communist era apartment block.
Now, I see there's a question in the chat about your grandfather. To me, in some ways, it seems to almost personify American Jewry at the time, that feels very connected to Eastern Europe, his Eastern European roots, but seems somehow aloof from the increasingly desperate situation of their brethren. But he must have been a charismatic guy. The kids were running, following him around like that. I guess it made for the camera, but he must have had something going for him as well.
Yeah, well, I think he was an approachable person. The arrival of an American in town would have been a created a commotion, and regardless of who it was. But I think that he also had a personality that kind of encouraged the kids to start waving and jumping at him. And the camera, of course, as Maury says in the film, was a novelty, and it was a kind of magical thing that everybody wanted to see and to be part of. So, but I think what you say is really true. I think, you want your grandparents to be heroes and to have been prescient and to know what was going to happen. But, their 1938 is not our 1938. They were living day to day. They didn't know what was going to happen. And my grandfather was an informed man. He was an avid newspaper reader. But, I think he, like most people, thought that it was a tense situation, but didn't know, what the consequences were going to be. So they changed trains in Berlin. The postcard that he sent, and it was to his 16-year-old daughter. He might not have said, "Oh, we're terrified and we can't wait to leave here," although he might have felt that, but he wouldn't necessarily have put that in the postcard. But I never met him. He died before I was born, and so I really can't say what he was thinking or what sense he had of the danger that was looming on the horizon.
So a tourist movie the film becomes this important historical document. I was wondering, in fact, when you just first discovered it was deteriorated with time, close to being lost. Any thoughts as to what we should be preserving today and in what medium? Is an iPhone better than Kodachrome when it comes to preserving our own family history?
Well, Kodachrome has a lot going for it. Among other things, it can sit in a closet for 70 years, and then you can just play it on a film projector if you have a film projector. Whereas your iPhone from 3 years ago or 5 years ago is probably unintelligible now. So, no, I think that there's a great danger. This is a big story and a big problem for archives that have now a lot of materials digitized, and you have to migrate the format every time there's a new innovation in computer storage. So what should we be saving? From my perspective now, as someone with a sort of archival bent and who has, gone through this story, you have to save everything. And on some level, this film, there was nothing special about it when he took it. It became special because of the history that happened around it. And we have no idea what's going to happen. We're just as clueless about 2022 or 2023 as he was about 1938 or 39. Yeah. So, I don't know what's going to be important, but I can sort of look backwards and say, the things that we have from our parents or grandparents or from our childhood, it's important to hold on to that stuff if you want, especially family related material. The funny thing is, one of the first things that gets lost are the names of the family, because of course, Uncle Izzy in the photograph or whatever. And so why would you bother to write who it is on the back of the photograph, right? But your kids, it's some kind of cousin or something, I don't know, somebody related to my parents, and their kids will have absolutely no idea and they'll throw it away, right? So, it's amazing how fast the intimate knowledge of the family gets lost. So I would encourage people to think about that when they go through the shoebox of photographs they have in the closet.
It's a very good point. So just to get the chronology, before the film we saw, you had written this critically acclaimed book about your grandfather's film, 3 Minutes in Poland. Then the film director, Bianca Stigter, she's Dutch and relied on your book. Can you tell us about the process of writing, how this your critically acclaimed book became a movie and how that worked and what your role was?
Sure. Well, so Bianca got in touch with me not long actually after the book came out, and she had seen a review or some information about the book and thought that it was interesting and was able to see the original footage online, which you can still do at the Holocaust Museum's website. And she immediately had this thought that it goes by so fast. Wouldn't it be meaningful to be able to stretch it out? She was at the time working as a film critic. She's a historian by training. And she got invited by the the Rotterdam Film Festival to create a video essay, which would typically be about some current film in which she'd do kind of a voiceover and analyze a scene or something. But she proposed instead doing this. And so she got in touch with me and asked if I'd be interested, which I was after a lot of conversations, because, you know, I had a very, very specific orientation towards this material. It's very, especially the color parts, are sort of very cinematic. It's very appealing and potentially very sentimental, which is what happens typically with footage of this era that you don't know anything about. You just put some klezmer music behind it and you see Jews in Poland. And it, to me, that destroys precisely what's specific about the film. So the fact that she was a historian was for me so important. And after talking for a while, I realized that she had this same dedication to preserving the individuality and the specificity of what we see in the film. So we agreed to work on this, and we did a 28-minute version of the film you saw this evening as a sort of trial case. And it seemed to work, and Bianca had this feeling that it could go longer. So yeah, the artistic vision for the approach is entirely hers. And then in a lot of conversations about the material, and I opened my archive of interviews and things like that to her, and we went and visited Mr. Chandler and did additional interviews with him. So yeah, I helped in this supporting way to bring the content out and again to kind of anchor the images in specific information.
And how did you get a Helena Bonham Carter to become the narrator? To me, she's always Mrs. Lovett.
Well, now she's a
performance by
Princess Margaret. Well, she was obviously a wonderful narrator for this film. I think she has that kind of questioning quality, which doesn't say, she's not saying, oh, this is what you're seeing. She's able to kind of bring you along as we discover things. I believe that the connection to her came through the co-producer, Steve McQueen, who had worked with her previously. And so she was someone he was able to contact and propose the project to her, and very graciously she accepted. So that's great.
What are you working on now?
Well, I just finished 2 books actually about the Empire State Building. The one is a novel, and one is nonfiction. And the nonfiction actually is, I guess, in some ways somewhat similar to 3 Minutes in Poland. It's about the men who built the building. And as a matter of fact, we don't know who built the Empire State Building. We know who designed it and who paid for it and who had the contract to build it. But as for people with tools in their hands, that information does not get passed down. Instead, what we have are these magnificent photographs by Lewis Hine of the construction, which are world famous, and they're sort of iconic. And precisely because they're iconic, nobody's ever bothered to ask who the guys actually were. So I've managed to identify many of the men who appear in Lewis Hine's photographs. Wow. So that's the book that's just finished that.
There are many religious Jews in Tinegel. I'm just wondering, the film mentions in passing that most religious Jews would have avoided being photographed. In your research, were you able to discover any information about the religious Jewish community of Nasielsk?
Well, the community was by definition religious. That's what, as Mr. Chandler says again in the film, religion just dominated the culture of the town. And you had the same kind of panoply of sects that you would have in any Jewish town of size, in that era. So you had a lot of different Hasidic sects, and they were not always friendly towards one another. And some were more orthodox than others. You had the Mizrahi, you had, the Agudas, you had everything that sort of constituted Jewish cultural life at the time. As for, it's not immediately visible in the film, right? But as I say, yeah, the most devout and religious people would have avoided the camera, although you see a few. And of course, there's that long sequence where people are exiting from the synagogue. and you see a lot of the
Yeah.
local community. But as for exactly who we're seeing and what their orientation was towards the religion, it's invisible. That's a piece of the culture that doesn't get captured on film.
Now, there are a few questions from the chat going back to your grandfather. First, whether your grandfather ever spoke or reflected on the film, to your knowledge. And second, what brought him back to his birth town? Did he have family there? Was it just curiosity, part of the tour of Poland? Was there something there in particular that might have drawn him back?
Well, the short answer to the question is I don't know. As I mentioned, he died before I was born, and so I never had a chance to meet him. And the only information that I had about the film came to me through my father and my aunt, and that turned out to be wrong. They both thought that it showed my grandmother's hometown, which it doesn't. I mentioned this in the film also, and it took me months and months to find a survivor from that town in order to have him say, no, never seen the place before. But what drew him back there, I can speculate a little bit. I mean, so they were traveling with these friends, Mr. Louis Molina, and his wife, Lillian, and his sister, Essie Diamond. Mr. Molina and Essie were both born in Nasielsk also. They were friends, lifelong friends with my grandfather. So I think that the fact that they were traveling together, there was this sense of, well, let's go back and see the old place. Mr. Molina's parents, or at least his mother, and I know my grandfather's mother, my great-grandmother, were both still alive at the time, and they were both from this town. So it's very possible that they went back to the town. Most of the family and even the extended family had emigrated in the 1890s. But I think that the camera maybe might have been a way of saying, of sort of showing the folks back home what the town looked like today. It had been 50 years since they had emigrated. So they wanted to see what it looked like. I don't get the sense from this film that he had gone back to see anyone in particular. So a relative, there are other home movies where, they'll show you the families or the family gathering, sitting around a table or standing in front of the synagogue or standing at the cemetery with their ancestors, which are clearly showing that they went back to see specific people. In this film, I don't see that. I think it was more of a general visit to see what the place looked like now.
And is there any takeaway for our own time, a time of increase, at times deadly anti-Semitism in our own country?
Yeah, I think there is. As I've said several times, for me, what was most important was to see these people as individuals, because in the absence of knowledge, it's very easy to kind of replace them with ourselves. And it's very common. You see a film like this and you don't know anything about it, and someone say, well, they look just like us. We know what they were like. And that I had a very powerful reaction against that kind of thought, that that's just pretending that we are, because we see their faces, we can know something about them. I really wanted to preserve what was lost when these people were killed. And what was lost was the complex interiority of an individual. They were just as complex, and their lives were just as meaningful and mysterious to them as ours are to us. And I think that I would hope that people seeing this would take away that sense of the power of individuality and the inconceivable loss when an individual is lost. And if we look at this and we see Jews in Poland, I think we perform a kind of erasure that was how the Germans saw them. They didn't see people, they saw a type. And I hope that by remembering the individuality, we can, that's the tool to combat prejudice, because prejudice is always about types, but relationships and interrelations, these are about people. So to remember that they are people.
Man, On that note, I just want to thank you, Glenn Kurtz, for speaking with us this evening, for becoming our guide to what was lost and what remains, and for your detective work in restoring names and faces and humanity to one town's victims of the Nazis, and for sharing your mesmerizing film. Your determination to restore a badly degraded 3-minute film and to resurrect these people's stories is really nothing short of heroic. So thank you, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
And be sure to join us for a final virtual film tomorrow at 7:30. Name of the film is 1982. It happens to be Lebanon's Academy Award nominee for Best Foreign Film. Immediately following that screening, there will be a live talkback with film historian Eric Goldman, who I happen to know is really amazing, and director Walid Mouanis. And then on Thursday, 2 days later, we switch to in-person. Teaneck International Film Festival begins with a story of bones at Teaneck Cinemas. I am Barry Lichtenberg. Thank you again. Good night, and take it away, Jerry.